Hello everyone, this is part 4 of What If Naruto Was Trained by Black Zetsu, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, to share, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Naruto blinked. What would I do? Blue eyes narrowed in suspicion. Why? Is Konoha gonna be attacked, or is this just another one of your weird tests? White Zetsu's yellow eye shifted slightly in the same movement Naruto had learned to identify as his tutor holding a private conversation. Finally, Black Zetsu stated, "We have discovered a conspiracy between Sunagakure and Otogakure that implicates them in an upcoming, joint invasion upon Konohagakure. Given this knowledge, what would you do?" Naruto paused to let the information sink in. If Zetsu was correct, then the hidden leaf was in trouble, but just because that was true didn't mean that the plant man wasn't also testing him. His first thought was that informing the higher-ups of the hidden leaf would probably be a good idea. He shook his head. That wasn't a wise move. For one thing, the likelihood of them believing him was small, though the Hokage might, considering their prior relationship, especially given his notoriety as a prankster, despite having not pulled a prank in months. Then, even if they did believe him, they would ask how he had come across that information, and that would reveal Zetsu's presence, which would deprive him of his tutor. That was unacceptable. Zetsu still had plenty that he should be able to teach him, not to mention that being found out to have connections with a missing nin would probably have unfortunate consequences. Besides, by Zetsu's philosophy, if Konoha couldn't figure out that it was about to be invaded, it probably deserved to suffer the repercussions of being caught unaware. But that opened up another set of problems. The hidden leaf was still his home, and he had nowhere to go if it was attacked. Even if he somehow managed to escape the village, once Konoha recovered, it would certainly send hunters to find him and bring him back, where he would then have to deal with the repercussions of his actions. Of course, there was always the chance he could be presumed killed in action, but that seemed unlikely without sufficient evidence. For now, the problem of surviving outside of Konoha on his own merit remained unchanged from the first time he'd discussed with Zetsu how to not be a tool. So that left, stopping the invasion on his own. Great, he thought with a scowl. That was even less likely than running away and being considered dead. One genin against the assaulting might of two hidden villages. The thought was laughable. Or, in the alternative, he could embrace Zetsu's tried and true philosophy and fend for himself. That probably had the best shot of keeping him alive, now that he thought about it. A strategy that involved doing nothing for Konoha and instead focused on protecting his own life. That seemed doable. Naruto looked at Zetsu. If there's no way to stop the invasion, I'd make sure I survive by any means necessary. But it would be best to stop it so that I can stay here and grow stronger in safety. Isn't there a saying, better the enemy you know than the one you don't? It would be bad if Konoha changed because of the invasion, right? Black Zetsu laughed. Keep the status quo for your own benefit. Defend Konoha for your own needs and protect yourself regardless of the outcome. What a clever solution. You're learning. Did I pass the test? Naruto wondered. After another private conversation, Black Zetsu said, "Follow us." The blonde resealed the bandages and jar of ointment, put the summoning scroll in his pouch, and then grabbed his olive-colored shirt and threw it on. Zetsu was already zipping through the forest ahead of him, popping up in random places so the blonde could keep track of where his tutor was heading. After almost 20 minutes of running, they finally stopped at the edge of the tree line overlooking a large building with a statue of a giant fish placed on either side of the roof. One of the fish had a small blip perched atop it, and Naruto realized that it was actually a person sitting there, looking at the moon. What? Naruto began, but Zetsu interrupted him. That boy is a genin of Sunagakure. There is something unusual about his chakra. It's reminiscent of yours, a blending of sorts. A blending. Naruto echoed. You think he's a Jinchuriki? The word was a little strange on his tongue. Zetsu had told him that that was what those who housed a tailed beast were called, though the plant man admitted that he had never actually met one before Naruto. The use, however, Zetsu had apparently heard of during the Third Shinobi World War, when Iwa and Kumo had mobilized the containers of the 4 and 8 tails, respectively. The tales of the destruction they wreaked were apparently legendary, and it made Naruto a little hesitant in approaching the person who could be soon as Jinchuriki. It's possible, White Zetsu chirped. It would be foolish for Tsunagakure and Otogakure to attack Konohagakure without an ace. All you need to do is remove the ace from the picture. Okay, the blonde agreed slowly, not looking away from the Sunanin. So how do I remove the ace? No idea, White Zetsu offered unhelpfully. Killing him would be the most prudent solution, but you don't know what he's capable of, so attempting that might put yourself in danger. I'd like to avoid that, he muttered, though I think that I'll be in danger no matter what I do. Well, maybe if I talk to him, he'll let something slip. With that, he walked out of the forest and jumped up to the roof, barely catching White Zetsu's cry of, "Good luck." The red-haired boy didn't pay him any attention, so Naruto, unsure how to proceed, hazarded, "My name's Uzumaki Naruto." "I don't care," responded the sand genin. "Leave before I kill you. Need to be careful about what I say." The redhead spoke so matter-of-factly that Naruto had little doubt he would carry out what he threatened if the blonde didn't tread carefully. It reminded him a little bit of Black Zetsu, though the Sunanin's voice was quieter and coarser than the harsh sneering of his tutor. "Don't you wanna hear what I have to say?" "No, I know what you're up to," Naruto blurted, completely contradicting his previous thought, and when the other boy turned dead, teal eyes on him, he knew that it had been a bad idea to say as such. I mean. Sand shot out from the gourd strap to the boy's back, and Naruto, having fully expected the meeting to go poorly, immediately sank through the building's tiled roof. Safe from the wave of sand, the blonde mentally thanked every god he knew that Zetsu had decided to show him the attack prevention technique. Above, he could hear the Sunanin trying to discern where his prey had gotten to, muttering words to himself in confusion. Sand, that would be problematic to get past if he wanted to somehow kill Gaara. Sand was essentially a derivative of earth, which meant that his poisoned senbon wouldn't be able to pierce it if it was used as a shield. Naruto waited until he could no longer hear the other boy talking before slowly releasing his chakra, allowing his head to meld out of the roof's surface. The Sunanin was still there, his gaze fixated once more on the moon. "Aren't you gonna go to sleep soon?" the blonde asked, looking for any opening in the boy's defenses. "No," he blinked, mildly surprised that the other boy had actually responded. Whatever urge that had gripped him and caused him to attack seemed to have faded. Either that, or he was just biding his time, waiting for Naruto to screw up. Well, he would just pull a Zetsu and remain merged with the roof to offer better protection, then, losing his life for some plan that might work to prevent Konoha's destruction wasn't a very worthwhile trade. When the Sunanin didn't seem to pay him any mind over the next several minutes, Naruto decided that it would be better to abort his plan for the night and try again some other time. He allowed the attack prevention technique to drop, causing his body to unmerge with the building. His reappearance must have grabbed his companion's attention, for the red-haired genin said, "That jutsu is a useful trick." Yeah, I suppose so. Once I figure it out, it will not prevent me from killing you." Naruto blanched at how deadpan the other boy's voice was. He laughed nervously. "Right, well then, I'm off. Gaara. My name, Sabaku no Gaara," intoned the redhead. "I will enjoy crushing the life from your body, Uzumaki Naruto." Naruto shuddered at the Sunanin's one-track mind, and then jumped off the roof and headed for home, unsure what to do next. Naruto walked past the secretary's desk and into the Hokage's office, his expression carefully neutral. It was uncharacteristic of the personality the Sandaime was used to, but then again, his new outfit was probably enough of an alert that he wasn't the same person he had been in the academy. And as he was being called in under unknown circumstances, Naruto preferred not to give anything away until he knew what was going on. Sarutobi Hiruzen was seated in his usual place behind his desk, the red and white Hokage hat resting on his head, a lit pipe settled between his lips. Off to the side, arms crossed over his broad chest, stood a tall man with long, white hair and red lines running down his face from beneath his eyes. He was dressed in a long-sleeved shirt, kimono and pants, green in color, accented by a thigh-length red vest. Mesh armor could be seen covering his lower arms and chest, leading Naruto to believe he was wearing some sort of mesh shirt underneath his outfit, and a horned forehead protector with the kanji for oil took the place of the usual leaf sigil. Jiraiya of the Sannin, Naruto recognized. After Zetsu had belittled him on how little he knew of his own village and its citizens following his ignorance of Tsunade, the blonde had found a book detailing the Second Shinobi World War and its major battles. He had skimmed through it because history was still boring, but Tsunade's prowess of neutralizing poisons had caught his eye, not to mention the epic battle in which she and her two teammates, Jiraiya and Orochimaru, had fought a Megacor's Hanzo the Salamander and survived. It was there the trio had been dubbed the Sannin, revered as some of the greatest shinobi Konoha had ever produced. It would behoove the blonde to be courteous, even if he had no idea why the white-haired man was there. Hokage-sama, Jiraiya-sama, he said, inclining his head politely, you called for me. The Hokage recovered quickly from Naruto's respectful address, unused to the deference. It had been several months since they'd interacted. Perhaps in that time, Naruto had grown up. Yes, Naruto-kun, I did. There have been some things brought to my attention by your sensei, and I wished to hear what you had to say about them. Crap. Ah, sure. Hiruzen eyed him for a moment, blowing out a puff of smoke as he did so. I suppose I could start by noting your differences in clothing and attitude. What brought about these changes? Naruto heaved a mental sigh of relief. This was a question he could answer easily enough. I realized that, as a shinobi, it was rude of me to not show respect to my superiors. Following orders is important, right? As for these, he continued, gesturing to his outfit, well, orange isn't very good for sneaking around and stuff, so I figured I should change to something less noticeable. It's not bad to buy new clothes, is it, Hokage-sama? The Hokage's face flickered briefly with an expression that Naruto hoped was guilt. As he had spent time with Zetsu and learned to decipher some of the plant man's expressions, he had decided to adopt some of White Zetsu's mannerisms. By widening his eyes marginally, or tilting his head to the side, or adding just the slightest pout of innocence and hurt to his voice, he figured he could instill a feeling of sympathy or guilt in whomever he was conversing with. All of that came, he supposed, from White Zetsu's childlike persona, as children couldn't really disguise what they were feeling. Even if it was some colossal ruse White Zetsu used for his own amusement, the fact that it seemed to be working was a blessing. Hiruzen shook his head. No, it isn't, he agreed. You mentioned that following orders is important, but Kakashi has indicated that you are often late to team meetings. Punctuality is also an important quality for shinobi to have. Naruto scowled at that. Kakashi-sensei makes us wait around for hours, he stressed, his aggravation with the man surfacing. If being on time is so important, how come he's allowed to get away with it? Aren't our superiors supposed to set a good example for us to follow? That's true, the Sandaime coughed, shooting a brief glance at Jiraiya. Our elders should serve as positive role models for future generations. Plus, it's not like Kakashi-sensei has actually taught us anything, Naruto interrupted, now fully involved in defending himself. In the back of his mind, the blonde recognized that he was becoming a bit emotional, something that could be dangerous, especially since the Hokage hadn't prompted him with another question, but his irritation at being placed upon Team 7 finally had a legitimate outlet, one who could do something. If the Hokage wanted to hear Naruto's side of the story, he would get the whole thing. All he does is sit back and read his book and talk about teamwork while we do missions. But Sasuke team and Sakura aren't interested in working with me. That bastard only wants to work by himself, and Sakura just follows him everywhere, so I'm left in the dust. If teamwork is so important, how come I got put with the two people who don't want anything to do with me? It's tradition to place the lowest ranked student with the highest ranked one in order to balance. Without any look at how they interact. Naruto asked, incredulous. That was a point that the blonde had been wondering for some time now. Why had he gotten paired with Sasuke and Sakura, two people who obviously didn't like him? Granted, most of his graduating class didn't like him, but they could have tried to team him up with people who were at least neutral towards him, like Shino or Hinata. Ino got paired with Shikamaru and Choji because of some connection among their clans, but Shikamaru and Choji were both near the bottom of the class. How's that balanced? It's not fair. Kid's got a point, Jiraiya mentioned, speaking for the first time since the meeting had begun. It took far too long for Orochimaru and me to get along and work cohesively. Who knows how much better off we would have been if he and I were on different teams. Except that Orochimaru served as a good motivator for you to grow stronger, did he not? Hiruzen pointed out. Jiraiya grunted in reluctant acknowledgement. Still, The same principle doesn't necessarily apply to all teams. Apparently not. The Hokage returned his attention to Naruto. It sounds like you're not very happy with your team, Naruto-kun. Is that why you failed the Chunin exams, to punish your teammates? It was, Naruto decided, better to be honest when he could so that his lies, when delivered, weren't examined closely. I wouldn't sabotage myself, Hokage-sama. He protested. I still wanna become Hokage. Okay, so that wasn't true in the slightest, but it was better to pretend that there was still some measure of the old Naruto lurking under the surface of this new, polite facade. That, too, should theoretically make his actions less suspicious, and the less he was looked into, the more he could accomplish on his own. If he had to manipulate any sentimentality the old man still held for him to achieve his own ends, so be it. Well then, Naruto-kun, do you have a suggestion for how to remedy this problem? Plenty, Naruto thought, but didn't say so aloud. Instead, he shrugged, keeping the image of a boy who wasn't sure how to answer a question. I dunno, can't I just leave Team 7? But then how would you learn anything? I've been teaching myself, he proclaimed with more enthusiasm than strictly necessary. It was a bit annoying how upbeat he had been before meeting Zetsu, as if saying something would happen in a positive voice could ensure that it would. The Hokage quirked an eyebrow in silent query of how such a feat was possible. Naruto tried to look sheepish as he offered, well, Ino's been teaching me about flowers, and since some of them are poisonous, I've been learning how to make poisons. That was a half-truth. During the sessions Ino taught him about flowers, she would warn him about any properties they had that he should be wary of. That included pointing out which ones were poisonous, like wolfsbane, a plant Naruto had full intention of using in a future brew. But it was convenient to have an out for when he was asked where his knowledge of plants and poisons came from. Though unlikely that Ino would be questioned, having a known source, especially since the fact that he spent plenty of time with her and the other members of Team 10 wasn't exactly a secret, would make the origin of his abilities far less suspicious. Any supplementary knowledge he got could be pointed towards books he had read after becoming interested in botany. To Naruto's mind, it was absolutely genius, and judging by the Hokage's mild expression of interest, the old man was buying it. That's a very unique skill set, Naruto-kun, and I'm happy to see that you've acclimated to a difficult situation, but what would you do about missions? As a genin, you can't take or perform missions without the approval of a jonin sensei, and you will eventually run out of money if you don't go on missions. Well, my team stopped meeting up since we failed the Chunin exams, the blonde began, so I was thinking about working at Ino's flower shop. Though he had yet to ask, the idea had come to him not long after Ino's explanation of the final round of the Chunin exams. With his fellow blonde busy brushing up her skills in preparation for her fight, Naruto figured her part-time position at Yamanaka Flowers would open up, especially if her father wanted to also take time out to train her. Not only would the job give him some extra cash in his spare time, but Yamanaka Flowers was the easiest way to get his hands on some wolfsbane. The Hokage nodded thoughtfully, tapping his pipe against the desk. I suppose that might instill a good work ethic in you, he allowed, but that leaves the fate of Team 7 rather unsure. Fortunately, he continued before Naruto could say anything, I have a solution. Kakashi has volunteered to take young Sasuke under his wing. Figures, Naruto thought to himself, resisting the urge to snort at what he saw as blatant favoritism. While Jiraiya here will oversee yours and Sakura's training. Blue eyes widened in surprise, now he had an explanation for Jiraiya's presence. Really, the opportunity to train under one of the legendary Sannin, even if it was alongside his erstwhile teammate, was unique, and if the man's reputation was anything to go by, sure to be worthwhile. The Hokage smiled. Yes, I will leave it to Jiraiya to discuss your training schedule. You're dismissed. Meet me at the 4th training ground at 10 tomorrow morning, Jiraiya told Naruto. Sure thing, Jiraiya-sensei, he acknowledged. See ya, Hokage-sama, and thanks. It was nice that things finally seemed to be looking up, Naruto mused as he left the Hokage Tower and ventured towards the usual patch of forest he met up with Zetsu in. Partway there, it occurred to him that the Hokage must have already had the idea of him becoming Jiraiya's disciple in mind and that the questions were a test of how he thought rather than actual prompts for solutions. He was, quite frankly, a little tired of having to think his way through the mental tests posed by others. Speaking of which, hey, Zetsu, guess what? He posed when the plant man made his appearance. I'm gonna be trained by Jiraiya of the Sannin. Congratulations. White Zetsu offered at the same time Black Zetsu cautioned, be wary. Thanks. And, why? Black Zetsu released a noise that sounded like a sigh of exasperation. Think, fool. Naruto heaved his own sigh but did as he was bade. Now that he thought about it, it was a little suspicious that, after being called out by Kakashi, he would get rewarded by being apprenticed to Jiraiya. Even assuming the Hokage had bought everything he'd said, and while he'd like to believe that was so, the likelihood seemed small, Naruto felt like there was something he was missing. Maybe, and it was entirely possible that his paranoia developed from working with Zetsu was in overdrive, Jiraiya's placement as his new teacher was a way to keep a closer eye on him. And what would happen if Jiraiya turned out to be as ineffective a teacher as Kakashi had been? Just because he had a reputation didn't mean he was qualified to be a teacher. Kakashi's reputation was impressive, if Zabuza's knowledge of him was anything to go by, and the silver-haired man had failed at passing knowledge on to his students. Did it really come back around to being distrustful of anyone who was placed in a position to influence his future potential, so much so that he actually had to learn everything by himself? But that wasn't necessarily fair to Jiraiya, who hadn't even been given an opportunity to show his teaching skills yet. You seem to have some measure of my warning, Black Zetsu observed, and Naruto tried not to frown at the comment. Was he really so transparent in front of his tutor? He thought he was getting better at hiding what he thought or felt, but apparently that wasn't so. Had he fooled the Hokage at all? Then again, maybe it was just that, subconsciously, he knew he had no reason to put up a pretense for the former Kusanin. Zetsu had no expectations either for or about him, meaning that everything he said was based off of observation. On the other hand, he had grown up around the citizens of Konoha, and their views of him were skewed by the image he had portrayed for 12 years. It was more beneficial to allow what he was feeling to show around Zetsu so the plant man could point out where he was making mistakes in his thought process. Around the village, not so much. Do not make us repeat the lesson you already know. Yeah, don't rely on anyone else, Naruto exhaled. You can stop nagging now. If you would remember our teachings, we wouldn't need to nag. But Jiraiya could teach him a lot, White Zetsu pointed out. I suppose that's true. He chuckled darkly. Even a man of such repute as the Sannin Jiraiya is not above being someone's tool. You will have to absorb as much knowledge as possible from him without falling for his tricks. No worries there, the blonde assured his tutor, I'm not interested in the wall of fire. He paused, as if to let Zetsu comment on his declaration, and when the plant man didn't, he continued, so what do you think he's gonna teach me? Unknown. Maybe you can ask about your elemental affinity. White Zetsu suggested. When Naruto opened his mouth to ask for elaboration, Black Zetsu cut across him and said, the element to which your chakra is naturally attuned to produce. As vague an explanation as that was, Naruto's blue eyes lit up in understanding. Oh, like how Sasuke can breathe fire. Yep. What's your affinity, Zetsu? It was Doton. Now, the plant man shrugged instead of finishing his thought, and Naruto could tell that Zetsu didn't care which element he was aligned with after adopting his current appearance. If Jiraiya asks, don't sign the summoning contract, Black Zetsu added. Naruto blinked. He'd heard about summoning contracts from the book he'd skimmed on the Second Shinobi World War. They were powerful tools used by shinobi to bring forth companions to aid in battle. In the Sannin's battle against Hanzo, the Amnin had called upon a giant salamander to help defeat the trio of leaf shinobi. Summons seemed to be versatile and useful weapons, even if they didn't exactly endorse the idea of fighting on one's own merit. You think he'd let me? We have no idea whether he would or not, but as he can summon toads, it is likely that he holds their summoning contract. If he does offer it to you, you can't sign it. It was strange that Zetsu, who promoted trying new things and allowing Naruto to find his own path, would outright tell him not to do something. Why can't I sign it? There are a multitude of special clauses in summoning contracts, Black Zetsu explained, including the ability of a summon to call upon its summoner through the Gyaku Kuchio's no Jutsu. It would bring you back to their home, putting you at their mercy. Do you really want that? Naruto grimaced at the thought of being at the Toad's or anyone's beck and call. No, thanks for the warning. But how do you know that? Kusa possesses 1 or 2 summoning contracts, Black Zetsu offered by way of explanation. In typical Zetsu fashion, Naruto noted that the answer didn't really explain how he knew the details of a summoning contract, but the blonde decided that if it really mattered, the plant man would tell him more. Still, this was Zetsu he was talking to, so, how do I know I can trust what you're saying? He's adapted well, White Zetsu noted. Briefly, Naruto wished he had 100 Ryo every time his tutor said that. Zetsu's darker side didn't dignify the statement with a response, instead telling Naruto, consider this a gift, no strings attached, no tests. Don't sign a summoning contract. After a moment of thought, the blonde nodded. Okay, Zetsu, I'll trust you, this time. No summoning contracts. LLL. Naruto crossed his arms at head level to block Ino's airborne flurry of kicks. She pushed off his limbs and back flipped through the air, release a trio of kunai at him as she did so. Nice combo, he complimented as she landed, lowering his arms and pulling out the kunai stuck in the right one. Pupil-less, baby blue eyes went wide when Ino found her equilibrium and looked at her sparring partner. I didn't think those would hit you, she exclaimed, a note of worry in her voice. Small wounds, he tried to reassure her as she walked up to him. She grabbed one long, olive-colored sleeve and pulled it down to reveal the extent of the injuries. You're worrying over nothing, really. When Ino didn't immediately release his arm, the Jinchuriki sighed and relented. Look, if you're this worried, just lift up my shirt and grab the jar on the far left. Ino did as her fellow blonde bade, taking the ceramic orb from its pouch and weighing it in her hand. Naruto noticed that she still had a grip on his dominant arm, so he said, if you could just let go of my arm, I'll do it, she interjected. Hold your sleeve up. His hand took the place of hers, and he watched silently as she uncorked the jar and brought it up to her nose. What is this stuff? Salve. I made it myself. Really? She dipped a finger in and came out with a greenish-brown glob, which she promptly began to rub over the injuries she'd inflicted. Bandages. Left kunai pouch. Ino dug into the pouch strapped to Naruto's left thigh, procuring a roll of bandages from it. Gently, she wrapped his right arm from wrist to just below the elbow, tying it carefully. Naruto silently watched her work, confused. The injuries were really only flesh wounds, but Ino was acting as if she had mortally wounded him. If the kunai had been poisoned, as most of his were, and he briefly entertained the thought of telling Ino to start doing the same to her weapons, he would be more worried, but as it was, she just seemed to be overreacting. Guilt, he guessed, was a powerful motivator. Still, the blonde would admit to himself that Ino fussing over him like a mother might was nice, in a way. It wasn't like he had anyone else to care about his well-being. Zetsu was far too independent and caustic to fret over him, and he didn't have any other close connections who would worry about him in a similar manner. His attention returned to his sparring partner when he sensed Ino glaring at him. What? Why didn't you dodge those? She demanded. Didn't see, he admitted. With his arms blocking his face from Ino's kicks, his vision had been compromised. He was more willing to let his arms get bruised and pierced by metal than his face, though he realized that he would have been left at the mercy of a second opponent, had one existed. Just one more weakness he would need to fix, though the idea of tricking the opponent into taking a kunai to an arm or leg instead of taking a blow to the face wasn't bad. Shinobi were more likely to allow a flesh wound to occur if the alternative was protecting something more vital, and since all of Naruto's equipment was poisoned, all he needed to do was take advantage of that mindset. It really was a good combo. Ino stared at him a bit longer before sitting on the ground with a sigh. Let's take a break. Naruto followed her example, taking it a step further by lying down beside her with his hands pillowed behind his head. How's your training going? Truthfully, his training with Jiraiya reminded him a lot of how he learned things from Zetsu. The Sannin apparently believed in giving Naruto an assignment and then leaving him to his own devices to figure out how to go about accomplishing it. He would often disappear after telling the blonde what to work on, and there was something in the way he grinned that made Naruto think whatever he did wasn't exactly savory. It was a good thing Naruto was used to the learn-on-your-own teaching methodology Jiraiya employed, otherwise he thought the constant abandonment would grate on his nerves more than it already did. Jiraiya had said that he was a little busy at the moment, which made the blonde think that he might be part of some defense force Konoha was putting together to combat the impending Otosuna invasion. Naruto hoped that the hidden leaf had a plan to thwart its invaders, but even assuming that was true, the blonde refused to trust his life in the hands of someone else. As a result, he had continued to approach Gaara to try to glean any information he could from the boy and construct contingencies, though without success. Maybe after the Chunin exams were over and there were less outside worries to focus on, Jiraiya would take a more hands-on approach with his training, though Zetsu's usual warning burned in the back of his mind. I think Jiraiya-sensei is busy with something else right now, he responded, so the lessons are kinda slow. That sucks. Still, to have one of the Sannin training you, that's pretty lucky. How's Billboard Brow treating you? She's gone. Even though he couldn't see it, Naruto could almost imagine the incredulous look on Ino's face at that announcement. Gone. Yep. Working in the hospital now. Wow. Naruto closed his eyes and enjoyed the brief lull in conversation. The situation with Sakura was actually a bit more complicated than he made it sound, but he found the details unimportant to impart upon his fellow blonde, a personality trait he attributed to Zetsu. As disturbing as it sounded, he was gradually adopting his tutor's quirks. On the first day of their training, Sakura had, hesitantly, buried the hatchet between them and apologized for her treatment of him during their time together on Team 7. Naruto had accepted her amends if only to promote a hospitable working environment, but had sworn to himself that they would never become friends. No matter how nice Sakura appeared, too much damage had already been done. He could forgive Ino for one transgression. Sakura's multiple slights against him were much harder to forget. As luck had it, though, he hadn't needed to put up with his pink-haired ex-teammate for all that long. Jiraiya had professed himself to be a poor tutor in genjutsu and other fine chakra manipulations, and Sakura, with her low reserves, extraordinary control, and desire to avoid combat on the front lines, had decided to enroll in the Medic Nin trainee program at Konoha Hospital, thus removing herself from the Sannin's tutelage. Naruto would count himself lucky if he never had to run into either of his former teammates ever again. The blonde raised both of his legs into the air and then brought him down, leveraging his body into a sitting position. Seated cross-legged, he put his hands on his ankles and looked at Ino. My turn now. You ready? Ino nodded, closing her baby blue eyes and bringing her hands into the ram sign. After a moment, Naruto started channeling his own chakra, seeding it into the ground beneath him while simultaneously coating his body in a thin layer. With the ease born of practice, Naruto sank into the ground with the attack prevention technique. Members of the Yamanaka clan were apparently not only known for their techniques involving manipulating the minds of others, but also for their sensing abilities. Ino hadn't yet begun training as a sensor-type kunoichi when Naruto had first brought up the topic, but she had started learning when he had pointed out how useful a skill it would be to have. Now, while Ino worked on her chakra sensing abilities, Naruto tried to perfect the Shinra Bansho's non-melding abilities, moving through mediums and becoming undetectable by senses. Since Ino was still an amateur sensor, it was hard to tell what progress he was making with the latter ability, but he had finally figured out the trick to the former. By spreading his chakra throughout a medium, he essentially created a path he could travel through. Theoretically, and according to Zetsu, he became undetectable because his chakra was then matched with whatever medium he was a part of. Naruto had his doubts about that, if only because he found it hard to believe that using chakra could disguise him from being discovered by a chakra sensing technique, but Zetsu had yet to steer him wrong. Not to mention it would be rather fitting for the plant man to teach him a jutsu so contradictory in nature. With deliberate slowness, he unfolded his legs and began to walk through the earth. It was a bit strange to be moving underground almost as easily as above it. The sensation of walking, although that wasn't quite the right word for what he was doing, phasing, perhaps, was more accurate, through dirt, rocks, and roots was rather unique. With time, he figured he would eventually get faster at moving through whatever medium he was in, but for now, getting used to the mechanism the Shinra Bansho employed was most important. He continued to phase through the underground, spreading his chakra into the soil and moving around in random patterns to test his above-ground partner. After what he determined to be enough time had passed, he released his hold over the attack prevention technique and surfaced 50 feet behind Ino. It took almost 15 seconds for her to turn towards his position and open her eyes, dropping her hands to her side when she saw him. I couldn't sense you, she sighed as he walked over. Well, that's kinda the point, Naruto observed. Yeah. But we don't know if that's because the jutsu is working or because She made a vague gesture to avoid admitting a weakness, and Naruto decided that improvements couldn't be made if Ino wouldn't concede her shortcomings. Suck, he supplied. Ino glowered at him, but her lack of response was telling. You're getting better, he said, trying to boost her spirits, especially since you've only been doing this for a short time. And it didn't take you nearly as long to sense me this time. Thanks. Naruto ignored her sarcasm. We have plenty of time to practice before the final round of the Chunin exams begins, and it's not like either of us are going anywhere. Since Jiraiya was busy with things in Konoha, and Naruto didn't have a team or teacher capable of performing missions with, he was essentially sidelined until at least the end of the Chunin exams. That was fine with him, as the break gave him more time to perfect the useful techniques he was adding to his arsenal, not to mention increasing the quantity of poisons he carried on his person. Good point, Ino conceded, then continued, I need to go meet with Dad. He's supposed to start teaching me a new jutsu. Are you sure you don't want to test your jutsu with him? He's a much better sensor than I am. Naruto shook his head. No, I want to keep what I can do secret for as long as I can. But can I come along anyway? I wanted to ask him something. Sure. Inoki was more surprised than hesitant when Naruto professed an interest in working at Yamanaka Flowers. It would give the man more time to prepare his daughter for her upcoming match, Naruto pointed out, and it wasn't like he didn't know about all the different flowers. Several of his lessons with Ino had taken place under Inoki's supervision, after all. Answer, after a demonstration of how to use the register, the finding of an apron in the blonde's size, and a verbal agreement of his hourly wage, Uzumaki Naruto found himself gainfully employed at Yamanaka Flowers. LLL. 2 weeks. It took an entire fortnight of meeting with Gaara and utilizing the Shinra Bansho to escape being crushed by sand to actually make some headway with the foreign genin. Naruto wasn't entirely sure why exactly the redhead decided to forego trying to kill him that night, or why he even decided to speak to him, but he was glad for the break. Perhaps in his own way, Gaara respected the fact that the blonde was strong enough to continuously avoid death blows, and so was rewarding him for a feat which others had yet to manage. If nothing else, the redhead seemed both perpetually amused and aggravated by the attack prevention technique which continually denied him his kill. Not that the reprieve meant that Naruto wouldn't remain wary of any potential tricks on the Sunanin's part, but it still opened up the opportunity to get somewhere with hindering the invasion plan. I know that you have 2 different types of chakra in you, Naruto stated after they had sat in silence and stared at the moon for several minutes. Apparently it was one of Gaara's pastimes. He turned to look at his red-haired companion. Are you also a Jinchuriki? A Jinchuriki? What an apt title, Gaara mused. His voice seemed to hold no inflection whatsoever, making it difficult to discern what he was thinking. In some ways, the Sunanin reminded him of his former classmate Aburame Shino, though intensely more bloodthirsty and creepy. I have always considered myself a monster, but a Jinchuriki, how fitting. Something in the way Gaara said that made Naruto think there was more to his story than he knew. What do you mean? Jinchuriki, a power crafted from the sacrifice of another human. It is fitting because my birth took the life of my mother, and then, for the past 6 years, I have taken countless more lives as my father sent his own shinobi to assassinate me. Gaara's eyes widened slightly as he spoke, his pupils shrinking to pinpoints as if reflecting his insanity. Naruto was put off by his companion's candor, unable to imagine living a life like the Sunanin was describing. So much about the redhead's attitude and personality seemed to be explained based off of that one little tidbit of information. Gaara wasn't finished talking. When you are targeted by your family for assassination and feared by your village, you try to find a reason for existing. There must be a reason to live, and the conclusion I came to was that the reason I must exist was to kill everyone else. Family, love, these words are completely meaningless. Fighting for only yourself, living while loving only yourself, if everyone else in the world exists only to allow you to experience those feelings, that is enough of a reason to live. He turned pupil-less teal eyes to Naruto. That is why I will eventually kill you. Naruto remained silent for all of 5 seconds before he burst out into laughter. In reality, there was absolutely nothing funny about what Gaara had just said. In fact, it spoke of a rather tragic existence that the blonde knew his life didn't even compare to. But everything Gaara was saying was practically the same as the lessons Zetsu tried to impart upon him. The Sunanin didn't care about strangers or friends or family, he fought for himself and only himself, killing people to verify his existence. He was, essentially, Zetsu's perfect disciple. Granted, the former Kusanin wasn't a mass-murdering psychopath, cannibalism aside, but then again, Zetsu's philosophy had room for interpretation. Gaara's view of the people who inhabited the world around him was probably close enough to his tutors that Naruto could imagine how the redhead would respond to whatever he said. He had just found a window of opportunity, and he had every intention of trying to take advantage of it. Allowing his humor at the situation to abate, Naruto turned his blue eyes to meet Gaara's blank gaze. Sorry, he apologized, I just know someone who thinks a lot like you. I mean, I think a lot like you, too, though I've never killed someone. He paused at that, taking a moment to appreciate the irony of training to be an assassin while having no kills under his belt. At some point, he would have to cross that bridge, but for now, he had a different mission to complete. So, are you gonna tell me about the invasion, or? His only reply was a stream of sand that forced him to activate the attack prevention technique. He moved through the building and emerged from the side, knowing that Gaara would have sand swirling around the location he had been occupying. So I guess that's a no, he called. Waving to the sand genin, the blonde took off with a departing shout of, you'll tell me eventually. LLL. Tell me why I should not just kill you. Naruto offered his fellow Jinchuriki a wry grin. If you could, I'm pretty sure you would have by now. Gaara turned away from him at that, but made no sound to indicate the statement was untrue. Instead, he said, you keep speaking of an invasion, but you have yet to show evidence supporting your claim. True, the blonde allowed, except that I know that Suna and Oto are planning to invade Konoha. I knew that you were a Jinchuriki, didn't I? You're probably the main part of the attack, right? The redhead was silent for a long time, and Naruto was content to stare at the sliver of a moon hanging in the sky before his companion intoned, I am to release Shukaku in the middle of Konoha during the third phase of the Chunin exams. Naruto wasn't sure whether to be more surprised at the fact that the Sand Genin had actually told him the plan, or that said plan was so simplistic. Shukaku is the demon sand spirit sealed within me. It is the Kazekage's hope that the monster will kill enough of Konoha's forces to give Suna the advantage in battle. Why you going along with this plan? Orders. You've been killing assassins since you were 6, and you don't care about anyone else, Naruto pointed out. I hardly think you care about what you're ordered to do. When Gaara didn't immediately say anything, the blonde continued, besides, if you release Shukaku, is it really you killing people? The redhead turned his teal eyes towards the other Jinchuriki. You mean to dissuade me from partaking in the invasion? Naruto shrugged. By your own admission, you want to kill people to prove that you're alive. Not only that, but you said that you fight for yourself, and yet, you're prepared to sacrifice all these kills to the monster inside you on someone else's orders. How is any of that proving your existence? Gaara continued to stare at him. I was under the impression that most Konoha nin were weak-willed, intoned the redhead, but you are different. More uncaring, tenacious. You are a monster like me, yet, why do you fight for those who despise you? The blonde shook his head. I don't, I fight for myself. But if you destroy my home, where can I grow stronger? There was another stretch of silence, during which the two Jinchuriki merely stared at each other. Finally, Gaara asked, what do you plan to do with the information I have provided you? Naruto shrugged again. Nothin'. It's up to Konoha to defend itself against attacks, so long as it comes out mostly unscathed, whatever else happens, happens. I just wanted to remove the ace, he said, quoting Zetsu. You were cold, ruthless, and yet, you did not attempt to kill me, Gaara noted. That would have been the most prudent way to remove the ace, as you say. I didn't know if I could, figured learning how you thought and trying to plan around the invasion was the better way to go. Intelligent, had you attacked me, you would have died. It was said so matter-of-factly that Naruto had little doubt it was true, especially after almost being crushed by Gaara's sand for 3 weeks now. So, what are you gonna do? Gaara turned away to stare once more at the moon. Leave now, he commanded. I look forward to facing you in a true life and death battle someday. When I crush you and absorb your blood, the victory will be much more satisfying. Surprised at the easy dismissal, Naruto decided to heed his fellow Jinchuriki's order, and for the first time since they had met, the blonde left Gaara's company without an attempt on his life. As he bound away, Naruto wondered where Gaara's change of heart had come from. If his departing words were any indication, the redhead still sought appeasement by the deaths of those around him, which meant that Naruto hadn't struck any chord with Gaara's inner humanity, assuming the Sunanin actually had any. But that was fine. The blonde's intention hadn't been to rehabilitate his fellow Jinchuriki, merely to dissuade him from going along with the invasion plan. And it was all to benefit himself, to continue to have an environment that he could safely build up his skills in. Everything he was trying to achieve was for his own selfish purposes. The only reason he'd started talking to Gaara was to try and manipulate the boy into letting something slip. He didn't expect the Sunanin to actively defend Konoha, he just wanted him to not attack Konoha. It was fortunate, he supposed, that Gaara's ideology was rather similar to Zetsu's own, and thus to Naruto's own, though the sand genin had been immersed in it for far longer than he had, otherwise the blonde would have had no idea how to go about manipulating his fellow Jinchuriki for his own purposes. Naruto paused in his movement and nearly palmed his forehead as the similarities between his situation with Gaara and Zetsu's situation with him struck home. He had done for the redhead exactly as his tutor had done for him. I'm Gaara's Zetsu, he realized, equal parts amused and horror-struck. Wherever he was at the moment, Zetsu was probably laughing to himself at his ingenuity. Granted, Gaara hadn't agreed to anything yet, but his lack of trying to kill the blonde spoke volumes. Despite his desire to kill all who confronted him, Gaara seemed to respect something. Naruto wasn't sure what it was exactly, but he figured he possessed it, otherwise the redhead wouldn't find him worthy enough to listen to. Was it strength? Given that he hadn't advanced through to the final round of the Chunin exams, Gaara's dismissal of him during their first meeting made sense. He hadn't been anyone worthy of note. Then again, he so far hadn't proven anything to the Sunanin except that he was skilled enough to sink through the roof of a building to avoid being crushed by sand. That wasn't really strength, it was more strategy. He could show Gaara his strength, or at least the abilities with senbon and poisons he'd developed up to this point, but if the redhead said that trying to attack him would have resulted in his death, Naruto had little reason to doubt him. Gaara was nothing if not candid. So if it wasn't strength, what was it? What quality did he possess that Gaara found intriguing enough to listen to? Naruto shook the thought from his head as he arrived at his apartment complex and worked his way up to his room. It was useless trying to think about it, and if Gaara was anything like Zetsu, which he was, he would be unlikely to say anything unless Naruto figured out the answer himself. And in the end, did it really matter what the answer was? So long as the result was what Naruto wanted it to be, Gaara's personal reasons for paying him any attention were inconsequential. They weren't friends, they weren't comrades, they weren't even members of the same village. They were just two selfish Jinchuriki fighting for their own beliefs. Tomorrow, he would go back to Gaara, as he'd done for the past 3 weeks, and see where the redhead stood with his proposition. Naruto could only hope that his fellow Jinchuriki would see things his way. LLL. So, tomorrow, huh? Gaara turned his gaze to the blonde, his expressionless visage clearly visible in the light of the almost full moon. Yes. Naruto fidgeted uncomfortably at his fellow Jinchuriki's teal eyes, his fingers twitching near one of the ceramic orbs hanging in its pouch. Not yet, he cautioned himself, wait until you have to. Are you ready? He asked, changing his real question at the last moment. Gaara's centrality in the impending invasion made him even more wary of the Sunanin than usual, given that the third round of the Chunin exams was scheduled to take place the following day. Despite inquiring several times over the past week, Gaara had yet to give him a straight answer on what he was going to do, unsurprising, given the redhead's similarity to Zetsu, and Naruto was making one last attempt to see if the insane sand genin would give him any sort of inkling as to his intentions. Yes, the redhead's monotone was beginning to irk Naruto. Did you even train during the time off? No. Then, instead of leaving the blonde hanging, Gaara continued, what purpose is there in training when there's no one capable of matching your strength? Unspoken went the fact that training also served no purpose when your actual agenda involved relinquishing control of your body to the powerful demon you contained in order to destroy your enemies. Gaara didn't seem to care much about whether or not he'd be promoted to Chunin. Just one more similarity the two Jinchuriki shared. Fair enough. Finally deciding he had to know, Naruto ventured, do you know what you're doing tomorrow? Gaara's face remained impassive, and to fill the silence, the blonde continued, "Don't go through with it. You'll just prove that you're a tool of your village." "Shut up," Gaara ordered. Naruto's mouth snapped close of its own accord, Blue Eyes noticing that the foreign Jinchuriki was gripping his head with both hands, eyes closed to some inner demon. "Leave," he rasped, "or you'll die before I can enjoy crushing you on my own terms." Naruto heeded the command and took off, hoping that Gaara would come to his senses and see things his way. If nothing else, the blonde had his contingencies, the first of which involved staying far away from the arena tomorrow. LLL. Naruto stood at his stove the next morning, his attention focused on the skillet before him. Grabbing the soy sauce from where he had placed it, the blonde added a careful stream to the pan, mixing it with the eggs and rice vinegar already sizzling over the fire. Ramen was great and everything, and it would always remain his favorite food, but it was hard to grow physically when the noodles consisted of his only meal, morning, noon, and night. So, with no pressing business to attend to that morning, Naruto had decided to try his hand out at cooking an actual meal. Tamagoyaki seemed simple enough, though it was honestly a little too sweet for his tastes, which were used to the flavorful spices of ramen. Thus, instead of sugar, he had opted into substituting soy sauce, which would give his meal a much saltier flavor. So far it was turning out okay, though Naruto's worry about burning his breakfast had him keeping the burner at a low flame to not overcook the eggs. As steam from the pan spiraled upward, the blonde thought about the manchineel gas he had yet to figure out a way to capture, the past several weeks having been devoted to a different project. Deciding there was no better time than the present, he created a clone, whom he handed his spatula over to, instructing the doppelganger to keep an eye on his omelette, and then held out his hands, with the tips of his thumbs, pointer, and middle fingers on one hand touching their fellows, high above the skillet, palms facing down. Focusing intently, he gathered his chakra and sent it to his hands. Blue energy filled the void between his pointer fingers and thumbs, creating a roughly spade-shaped film of chakra. Tea, he requested, eyes watching his chakra to make sure the construct was steady. His clone picked up the teacup next to the stove and brought it to his lips. The blonde downed the remaining half, his third cup so far, before allowing his copy to return to making breakfast. With measured slowness, he began to pull his hands apart, allowing the film of chakra between them to stretch. It was strange to watch his chakra actually bend to his will. Most of the time, he considered chakra an internal thing, and Jiraiya had told him that his large reserves would make finer chakra manipulations more difficult. But Naruto was determined to succeed. If he could create the manchineel gas, there was no telling where he could go from there. When his chakra covered roughly the same area as the skillet, he began to lower his hands. The steam from his breakfast hit the chakra barrier and began to spread out, seeking freedom from its captor. Frowning, Naruto began to manipulate his chakra so that it started to curl beneath his hands, forming a rim to keep the vapor beneath his net. The task was more difficult than he thought. For one thing, his hands were covering his field of vision, so he couldn't really see if his chakra was reacting as he wanted it to. In addition, controlling chakra that wasn't actively touching some part of his body was a bit more difficult than that which he was in contact with, like using it for the tree and water walking exercises, and the blonde was already not the best at chakra control. Only the knowledge that he absolutely needed this exercise to work for his ninja career to be successful kept him pushing through his aggravation, the tip of his tongue sticking out of his mouth as sweat poured down his face. To capture the manchineel gas, his chakra would have to be molded into some sort of container, so he pumped more chakra into the construct, trying to extend it down into what would eventually be a roughly cone-shaped vessel. There was a loud rapping at his front door, and, thrown off by the sudden intrusion, all of his chakra dissipated into the air, followed quickly by the unfurling steam of his breakfast. Damn it! His head swiveled in the direction of the door. Who the hell? Hey, Naruto, open up. Ino. He wondered. He hadn't even realized Ino knew where he lived, let alone that she would actually take the time out to visit, especially since she was going to be due at the stadium soon for the Chunin exams. More curious than upset that his potential breakthrough with collecting the manchineel gas had been disturbed, he walked to the door and opened it, revealing his fellow blonde in all her usual glory. Took you long enough, she huffed. Sure, he agreed, staring at her as if doing so would puzzle out why she was standing on his doorstep. They pair stood in silence for several seconds before Ino arched an eyebrow and asked, "Aren't you going to invite me in?" Sure. he repeated, still confused. Ino stepped past the threshold and into his apartment, allowing him to close the door behind her. She sniffed the air and then questioned, almost incredulously, "Did you cook?" Yeah, he managed, brain returning to some semblance of functional. Sitting on the counter was his Tamagoyaki, courtesy of his clone, who had apparently taken it upon himself to finish preparing breakfast. Another cup of steaming green tea was placed next to it. Naruto stared at the swirling vapor wistfully, hoping for another opportunity to try and trap it with his chakra. So, what are you doing here? Ino's baby blue eyes, roving around the apartment, focused on him. Oh, well, I wanted to thank you for training with me this past month. And for taking over my job so Dad could take some more time out to train with me. I really appreciate it. Well, you're welcome. When Ino didn't say anything else, Naruto prompted, "Well, if that's it, I've got some things to take care of, so good luck with You're not coming down to watch my match." Naruto blinked in surprise. He hadn't expected Ino to care whether or not he was present in the arena as a spectator. Actually, he had been banking on the fact that, as a relatively disliked person, his lack of attendance at the Chunin exams would be appreciated more than showing up to root on his peers, which essentially amounted to just Team 10. Besides which, Gaara's agenda was still up in the air, and Naruto preferred being far away from the central location the invasion was going to take place at. Well, no, but you have to come. I do. Yes, I want you to be there. There was a moment of silence following her admission, and it was clear that Ino was as surprised at saying the words as Naruto was to hear them. Ino pushed past it first, continuing in a rather fierce tone, "Friends are supposed to support one another." Not for the first time, Naruto wished he had a prior friendship to ascertain whether the things Ino said were true or not. Then again, if it was this complicated to have a friend, perhaps it was better that he had no previous experience. Friendships, despite their usefulness in certain areas, giving him a training partner, for instance, sounded like a pain to maintain. He appreciated Ino, but he didn't know if that meant he should risk his life to oblige her desires. The Yamanaka was fixing him with a look somewhere between glaring and pleading, and Naruto briefly cursed himself for his choice in a friend as hard-headed as he was. He observed her for a moment, trying to work through the enigma that was his fellow blonde. She was stubborn and spirited, intelligent but emotional, and she often said things without thinking about them. If he wanted to continue to use their friendship for his own purposes, it was better to acquiesce to the reasonable demands she made in order to keep her happy. Besides, as it stood right now, he wasn't necessarily in danger just by going to the stadium, and he always had his contingencies. Fine, he relented, "I'll be there. Way high up in the stands, so I can make a quick getaway if I have to." Ino embraced him and then pulled away quickly, mildly embarrassed. "Thanks, I'll be sure to do my best now that I know you'll be there." It didn't make much sense to him that she would want to try harder just because he was there watching, but Naruto decided not to question it. Some things were probably best left unexplored. Knowing that going to the arena unprepared was a bad idea, he walked over to his dresser and opened the topmost drawer. Throwing on his olive shirt over the gray one he was currently dressed in, he clasped the pouches at the bottom into place and slid the scroll containing his senbon and kunai into one of them. Blue eyes slanted over to the one ceramic jar that was separated from the rest, and he grabbed it and placed it within the leftmost pouch before closing the drawer. Fully prepared for the challenges that lay ahead, the blonde slid his tamagoyaki to a paper plate, downed his cup of tea, and transferred several more leaves into a ceramic thermos. After pouring the still hot water from his kettle into the thermos and capping it, he turned to Ino and gave her a wan smile. "Ready to go," he said, sliding his thermos into one of his pouches and grabbing the plate with his breakfast. Ino returned his gesture with a more genuine one. "Time to kick some ass." LLL. In Naruto's opinion, the arena was way too large. It was circular in shape, hundreds of feet in diameter, and comprised of mostly dirt and short grass. Trees lined the outside, ringing the concrete wall and providing the only measure of protection in the otherwise open space. 3 massive grandstands were built above the curvature of the wall, occupying about a third of the circumference. They were so high above the ground that Naruto wasn't sure how anyone was supposed to get a good view of the fights that were to take place down below in the stadium. He was currently sitting cross-legged on the yellow roof of the far left grandstand, knowing that finding a seat where he wouldn't be hassled would have been near impossible. His fingers drummed a nervous beat against his thigh, right foot twitching spasmodically to an even faster rhythm. He took another draught of tea and tried to focus on the figures down below. While he didn't know all of the genin, even from his height he could easily distinguish between the different groups. Team 10 was grouped at one end, followed by a girl with her hair tied up in buns. A long-haired brunette Naruto knew to be a male only because of the altercation outside room 301, and Rock Lee. Next to them were three shinobi in neutral colors Naruto guessed to be from the hidden sound, and separated from them by some distance was a teen in a black bodysuit, a dirty blonde wielding a fan, and Gaara. The Sunanin's head turned so he was looking in Naruto's general direction, causing the blonde's fidgeting to momentarily cease. Can he sense me? Is that some power that Jinchuriki have that I haven't learned? Gaara turned away to listen to a taller figure addressing the genin, and Naruto took a long sip of his beverage to try and soothe his nerves. It didn't work. No matter what happened, Gaara would probably always disturb him, he concluded as his fidgeting continued. The first match will be between Hyuga Neji of Konoha and Abumi Zaku of Oto, announced the proctor. If everyone else will clear the field, we can get started. Naruto watched as everyone but the long-haired male on Lee's team and the sound shinobi with spiky hair headed for a doorway built into the arena wall. When only the two combatants and the proctor remained, the latter held up his arm and then brought it down swiftly. Begin. Naruto watched the Oto nin bring both his arms forward, palms facing his opponent. From the way dust and dirt was kicked up in a straight line, the blonde guessed that Zaku was using some sort of air attack propelled from his palms to assault his opponent. Neji easily avoided the blast, prompting Zaku to increase the frequency of his attacks. Either Neji was very talented or Zaku wasn't, or both, for the leaf shinobi was making the Oto nin look like an inept fool. The Hyuga was practically dancing around Zaku's air bursts, using a taijutsu form Naruto presumed to be part of his clan's attack style. It irked Naruto just slightly to acknowledge that he really was quite ignorant of the specialties associated with Konoha's clans. Hinata had been in his class for years, but in all that time, he couldn't remember ever seeing how she fought. Then again, considering how caught up in hating Sasuke and idolizing Sakura he had been, the fact that he'd never paid attention to his classmates wasn't overly surprising. Still, it was annoying. How much could he have learned about the Hyuga, or the Yamanaka, or the Nara, just by associating a little more with Hinata or Ino or Shikamaru? Would Team 10's abilities and camaraderie be less confusing if he had even had the smallest inkling of how they fought ahead of time? The next blast Zaku pushed out seemed to double in size, and Neji spun himself around, producing a dome of blue chakra that repelled the assault. When it tapered off, the Hyuga sped forward with an open palm aimed at the Oto nin's shoulder. Neji's movements made even Ino look clumsy by comparison. For as much as she used her legs for the Yamanaka fighting style, Neji's arms speared around in seemingly random patterns that struck Zaku with what appeared to be rather ineffective hits. The Oto nin tried to maneuver one arm to blast the leaf genin away from him, but as he did so, Neji's palm came up and hit it. Zaku's arm exploded in a shower of blood, separated from his body at the elbow. Ouch! Naruto thought as Zaku released a pained holler, that's gotta hurt. The Oto nin was cut off when Neji delivered the final blow, Zaku collapsing in a broken heap. Neji was pronounced the winner after a moment, and the proctor announced the next match between Tenten of Konoha and Kankuro of Suna as medics came in and transported Zaku away on a stretcher. Neji was a talented shinobi, Naruto mused as the bun-haired kunoichi and the Suna nin dressed in black appeared in the arena. He was strong and composed, good qualities for a shinobi to have, and Naruto thought that he could tolerate someone indifferent enough to blow off his opponent's limb without flinching. Refocusing his attention to the arena, Naruto watched with interest as Kankuro dropped the bandaged bundle he was carrying on his back and Tenten drew out several kunai, launching them at her opponent. Kankuro dodged, but the leaf kunoichi immediately began to shower him with a hail of metal. The continued use of standard weaponry intrigued Naruto, and he leaned forward slightly, taking another sip of tea as he observed the fight. Tenten's lack of surname implied that she wasn't a member of any of Konoha's major clans, which meant that her abilities didn't rely on any specialized techniques. That, combined with the way she was now using kunai to knock down Kankuro's own thrown weapons before they reached her, hinted at a self-taught proficiency with projectiles. Exactly what he was trying to specialize in. She was the type of person Naruto had been looking for since resolving himself to becoming a master at throwing poison-coated senbon, someone he had no prior relationship with who could help him improve his style. Wheedling assistance from Iruka had always been a possibility, but the teacher was more likely to ask questions and get too attached, something Naruto didn't want. It was better to appeal to Rapia and potentially stroke her ego to get the training he desired. Manipulation was key to being a good shinobi. Tenten jumped into the air with 2 scrolls twirling about her form, hands swiping along the parchment and unsealing weapons from within with just a touch. Kunai, shuriken, and senbon barraged the area Kankuro was standing in, and Naruto was surprised when, instead of dodging, the Sunanin dove forward into the hail of weaponry. Metal impaled itself into his form, but he kept moving forward, unleashing several smoke bombs to conceal his attack. When the smoke cleared, Tenten could be seen lying unconscious on the ground, her scrolls collapsed beside her. Naruto took another drink of tea as the proctor announced Kankuro the winner, trying to figure out what had happened. It didn't look like Kankuro was bleeding, strange, since he had been pierced by plenty of weapons, nor was there an explanation for why Tenten was out cold. Was Kankuro also a poison user who had hit the leaf kunoiki with some sort of knockout gas or liquid? But that didn't explain why he was unharmed from Tenten's assault. He shook his head as medics came and placed Tenten on a stretcher, carting her off. There was no point in aimlessly guessing about what had happened, especially since he had no idea what Kankuro's abilities were. Maybe Tenten would be willing to give him some insight when he went to talk to her. Whenever that was going to be, first he had to survive the impending invasion. So did she, now that he thought about it. If anything, the fight had been a good indication that his specialty had weaknesses. Not that he knew what all of them were. Honestly, how had Kankuro managed to remain unscathed from all that weaponry, but it was better to discover them now than in the field, when his life would depend on it. Wind was another counter he would have to be wary of, if the fan user blowing away Shikamaru's kunai was any indication. Actually, now that he thought about it, most elemental techniques would probably pose a problem in open combat. Jiraiya had given him a basic rundown of the different affinities after he had followed Zetsu's urging and asked about his own wind release, which, he guessed was good. Apparently it was rare in the land of fire, and all of them could easily counter his chosen specialty. So he assumed, anyway. Jiraiya hadn't actually had time to go into specifics about the abilities of each element, having been called away for something, and the blonde hadn't wanted to ask Zetsu, who seemed to only give the least useful answer to any question. But observation was a powerful tool. Gusts of wind could be used to repel projectile weapons, and judging by the great fireball technique Sasuke had used back in the land of waves, fire could be used similarly. Earth's defensive prowess was obvious, though Naruto figured that if an opponent used a wall, he could just use the attack prevention technique to move through it for a surprise attack, and water would be difficult for both him and his weaponry to move through. He wasn't sure what lightning could do, but even still, weakness to 4 out of 5 of the primary elements wasn't a good sign. It made the manchineel gas all the more valuable for his future endeavors. His oath to focus on capturing the gas was interrupted by the announcement of the winner of the match below. Returning his attention to the goings-on at hand, he noticed that a length of darkness connected Shikamaru to his similarly posed opponent. Shikamaru's Kajmane, probably, he noted, though he was slightly confused as to why the girl was being awarded the victory. Perhaps Shikamaru, in his perpetual laziness, had opted into forfeiting. But then what was the entire point of catching her in his shadow in the first place? Naruto sighed quietly. More contradictions, it was all he seemed to stumble across nowadays, with lessons from Zetsu running rampant through his mind. He honestly feared for the day when he woke up and started talking in circles to himself. Speaking of people who talk to themselves, Gaara was making his way into the arena, the slouched Otonin walking not far behind him. After several moments, the proctor announced for the match to begin, and as the Otonin rushed forward, his left hand holding back the sleeve of his right arm, sand flowed out of the gourd on Gaara's back. Having only ever witnessed the sand attempting to crush him, Naruto was intrigued to see Gaara form a wall of silica in front of the other genin. When the Otonin slammed his fist against the barrier, Gaara's defense proved immovable, and the sound shinobi jumped backwards to avoid a hand of sand that shot out of the wall. So that's what he meant, Naruto mused, watching the Otonin bound around the arena to escape the clutches of Gaara's sand. The blonde had guessed that his fellow Jinchuriki's sand could be used defensively as well as offensively, as sand was merely an offshoot of earth, but to actually bear witness to it was rather informative. It explained why the sand shinobi had never felt threatened by his presence, and why he had been so confident that, had Naruto attacked, he would have been killed. His poisoned senbon would have never made it through the barrier that Gaara's sand could have formed. Good thing I decided to get more info first. Acting rashly without knowing Gaara's abilities ahead of time would have gotten him killed. His appreciation for gathering intelligence went up, as did his respect for Zetsu, who had discovered the information about the invasion. And now, he considered, fingers tapping against the jar hanging in its clasp, foreknowledge of what Gaara could do would save his life. The Otonin wasn't so lucky. Gaara's sand finally caught him, slithering up his body and wrapping him in a tan cocoon. Naruto forced himself to watch what came next, knowing that under different circumstances, it could have been him trapped within the crazed Jinchuriki's clutches. Slowly, the redhead extended his right arm and then clenched his fist. The sand encasing the sound shinobi contracted, and Naruto could see a red discoloration seeping out of the silica bindings. It was gruesome and cold-blooded, but the blonde was aware that it was the one thing Gaara thirsted for above all else. He could understand that mentality, the desire to do anything just to garner some semblance of recognition. It was, after all, how his old self had lived his life. Granted, Gaara wasn't killing others for the attention, but Naruto knew that when you found something to cling to, fulfilling that goal was all that mattered, no matter how depraved it was. Naruto waited for Gaara to be announced the winner, but it never came. Instead, the proctor appeared to hunker down into a defensive posture as a tall man, and then Gaara's teammates leaped out onto the field. From the corner of his eye, the blonde saw a great purple barrier rise up to engulf the box the cages were sitting in. Is this it? He downed the rest of his tea in several quick mouthfuls and stuffed the thermos into a free pouch. Has the invasion started? Beneath him, the distant sound of kunai clashing echoed out, but he ignored it in favor of keeping his attention focused upon his fellow Jinchuriki. Gaara appeared to be standing opposite his teammates, arms crossed over his chest, while the taller Sunanin had engaged the proctor in battle. There were several seconds of nothing, and then the sand genin turned his head slightly, and Naruto could practically feel the heaviness of his dispassionate, teal-eyed gaze settle on him. Even as far away as he was, Naruto knew that Gaara's stare promised his eventual death, but he felt that there was something else silently being communicated in that look. The redhead's gaze continued to remain where it was, even as his teammates began to gesture wildly. Sensing that the Sunanin wanted to speak with him, Naruto hesitated, weighing his options. The invasion had clearly started, but Gaara had yet to morph into Shukaku. It gave Naruto hope that the foreign Jinchuriki had actually abided by the discussion. But just because the redhead was still in his human form didn't mean that Naruto was safe approaching him. Despite Gaara's candor over the past month, the boy was still a ninja, and it was entirely possible that he was simply waiting for him to get close enough to crush him. After all, Gaara had said that he wanted to kill him with his own hands. What if he was waiting to accomplish that goal before deciding to follow through with the Kazekige's orders? I guess it's only fair to hear him out, he thought with a sigh. He's had to listen to me for the past month, after all. Throwing caution to the wind, and labeling himself as crazy for even coming to the Chunin exams in the first place, he stood up and made his way to the edge of the roof, using chakra to climb from there to the pillar holding up the stands. In a minute, he was in the arena and approaching Gaara and his teammates, chakra flowing along his body to activate the attack prevention technique, should it be required. Gaara's teammates turned around and adjusted their weapons as he neared, but the redhead intoned, "Stop, his death belongs to me." The other two Sunanin exchanged brief, fearful glances before backing down, moving behind their teammate to give him space. Naruto and Gaara stared at each other for a long moment before the former said, "Killing me won't be easy." "No," Gaara agreed, "it will not." His head moved to gaze into the stands, where Leaf Shinobi were fending off invaders from sand and sound. "But now isn't your time." Naruto guessed that was supposed to be comforting, though he remained guarded. "So, you decided. I am not an instrument of my father." That, the blonde decided, was probably Gaara stating that he had no intention of partaking in the invasion. The Sand Kunoichi apparently guessed the same thing, for she immediately protested, "Gaara. You can't just. I can do as I wish, Temari, I am no one's tool." His teal eyes shifted to look at her. You can try to stop me, if you so desire. Sand swirled about his feet like a cat stropping his ankle, but your life will be forfeit. Neither of Gaara's teammates said or did anything upon hearing his threat, a decision Naruto considered wise. He tensed slightly when Gaara's gaze returned to him, then coughed to cover it up and admitted, I didn't think you'd follow through. I was watching you during the matches, Gaara intoned, and an involuntary shudder ran down Naruto's spine. Said in that emotionless voice, Gaara sounded like nothing short of a psychotic stalker. You had no reaction to who won or lost, or the blood shed during the fights. You truly are like me, cold, uncaring, interested in only yourself. If you need a place to grow stronger, so be it. I look forward to a true battle between us, monster versus monster. Your death will be much more satisfying if you struggle. Ah, thanks, I guess. It was convenient that Gaara had acquiesced to his wishes, but Naruto wasn't naive enough to trust his future to the insubordinate, psychotic Sunanin. Self-reliance dictated he depend on only himself. Gaara had betrayed his father's planned betrayal, and now Naruto would do the same thing. Hidden from view by his sleeves, his fingers deftly unclipped the clasp holding his lone ceramic jar in place. It rolled into his hand, and with a quick lob, shattered on the ground. Pale yellow smoke engulfed the immediate area, and when it cleared several moments later, Gaara and his two teammates were sprawled on the ground, asleep. Naruto smiled at his accomplishment, a feeling of pride stealing over him. The contents of his now broken ceramic had been a mixture of lavender, pilfered from Yamanaka flowers, and hop, gathered by a strangely eager white Zetsu in the land of woods upon Naruto's request, plants which possessed sleep-inducing qualities. After placing them in the jar and then corking it, he had heated the contents into a gas, assuming that even if Gaara's sand could stop physical attacks, he'd still be vulnerable to something as intangible as vapor. The blonde flexed his hand, noting that his antidote had also worn off. His fingers no longer twitched from the increased tea intake, the caffeine coursing through his system having neutralized the lethargic properties of the sleep bomb. Zetsu had been right. Nature truly was a worthwhile friend or a harsh foe, depending on how it was used. It was yet another good reminder that knowing how to counteract each of his poisons was vital. Tea, he thought, amused, who would have thought? Zetsu's a freaking genius. He looked around at the various clashes occurring in the grandstands, blue eyes coming to focus on Gaara's prone form. If there was one thing Naruto knew, it was that being around when Gaara did eventually come to was a bad idea. The less he hung around the arena, the better. I'm outta here. LLL. Naruto looked out over the crowd of people gathered below him, expression pensive. Like him, they were dressed all in black, although their heads were hung in mourning. The blonde was positioned on a building with a good vantage point of the memorial dedicated to the departed third Hokage. Konoha's leader had apparently sacrificed his life to protect the village during the invasion the previous day, and it seemed that the entire village had turned out to show its respect. For his own part, Naruto wasn't sure how to feel. The third had certainly been an important part of his life for a number of years, though his connection with the elderly man had degraded over time. If nothing else, the third sacrifice merely proved that his decision to not become Hokage had been the correct one. The wall of fire only led to an early demise. More troubling than that, though, were the words his fellow Jinchuriki had imparted upon him right before being rendered unconscious. Was it true that he was really as cold and detached as Gaara? Yes, he had left the stadium as soon as the major threat had been neutralized in order to preserve his own life, but that was simply the main tenet of self-reliance. He was a mere genin. What could he possibly do against an invading force comprised of what was certainly Chunin and Jonin? Naruto-kun, there you are. The Jinchuriki turned his head slightly at the voice. Hey Zetsu. White Zetsu's head tilted at the blonde's hesitation. Is there something wrong, Naruto-kun? He gestured vaguely at the right side of his own face, almost hopeful that the plant man would take the hint. Where Black Zetsu's unblinking yellow eye normally sat was instead snow-white skin, though still missing all the usual facial features of the plant man's dark side. In fact, the entire right side of Zetsu's body was pure white. When Zetsu continued to look honestly perplexed, Naruto finally managed, what happened to Black Zetsu? Oh, nodded the former Kusanin in understanding. He doesn't like coming to funerals. It makes him hungry. Naruto decided he didn't want to delve any deeper into that topic, finding the lack of Zetsu's snarkier half somewhat of a relief with the turmoil his thoughts were in. The white growth that was currently filling in for Zetsu's darker side made his tutor look marginally more human, or at least far less inhuman, especially since the Venus fly trap that normally encased his head had disappeared, and at the current time, he thought that speaking to the more simplistic white Zetsu would offer him more comfort than listening to black Zetsu berate him for his foolishness. Curious to see what his tutor's childish side would say, he asked, "Have you been to a lot of funerals, Zetsu?" Pondered the plant man, a disturbingly thoughtful expression on his face. "Not recently. After the war there were a lot of funerals, but since then, well, there's no one to miss." He cocked his head to the side. "Are you sad, Naruto-kun?" "Number," replied the blonde, a frown twisting his features, "but I feel like I should be." "Is that weird?" "Nope," white Zetsu chirped. "When you live for yourself, you don't care about how others make you feel." Naruto considered the former Kusanin's words, turning them over in his mind. It was true that he didn't particularly care what other people thought of him, having left that aspect of his personality behind with his orange jumpsuit, but did that imply that he had no feelings for others? Gaara's words returned to him, describing him as uncaring and aloof, insensitive to the suffering of others. He had his friendship with Ino and the rest of Team 10, but in a way, those connections were simply manipulations meant to further along his own abilities. Even his relationship with Zetsu was a form of partnership that benefited him more than the plant man. It was almost like he was using Zetsu simply for his knowledge and resources. After all, finding someone willing to train him had been his primary goal right before meeting Zetsu. Unless, was Zetsu manipulating him? Naruto wouldn't put it past his tutor to do so, though he didn't see how or why. Most of Zetsu's teachings focused on forcing Naruto to think for himself and learn from his own experiences, thereby removing the idea that the plant man was influencing him directly. It was hard to believe that Zetsu would even have a reason for manipulating him, but then again, he also didn't have too much of a reason to stick around Konoha, and yet here he was. Not that it really mattered. Naruto would take whatever tutelage he could get while it was still being offered, regardless of his tutor's intentions. The ends justified the means, just as they had when dealing with Gaara. Naruto shook his head in an effort to return his attention to the matter at hand. The loss of the third Hokage was certainly a tragedy, and yet, the blonde felt little for the man who had once been a grandfatherly figure to him. Had he taken to Zetsu's lessons so well that he actually didn't care about anyone else? Would he feel nothing if Ino died? Was he truly like Gaara? He voiced this thought aloud. "Gaara said that he and I were alike, do you think that's true?" "Of course." Naruto tried not to be offended at how quickly and surely white Zetsu responded, but the plant man continued, "You're both Jinchuriki." Naruto stared at his companion for a moment before remembering that white Zetsu only looked at the surface of things. The plant man had never met Gaara, only hearing about him from what Naruto had told him, and so he would have no idea what the blonde was referring to with his question. Black Zetsu would have a better idea, but then again, his response would involve testily telling Naruto to either draw his own conclusion or that his opinion didn't matter, only Naruto's perception of himself did. Looking at the evidence, which was that he really only associated with a handful of people, Naruto was forced to conclude that, yes, he really was similar to Gaara, although less insane. He only cared about his own goals, and would utilize whatever methods were required to achieve those ends. Konoha was nothing more than a place for him to grow stronger, its shinobi people to hone his skills against. Gaara regarded humanity as a person-mita possession. Once it had served its purpose, it would be killed or discarded. Naruto wanted to use humanity for his personal gain and then just ignore it. Playthings or tools, interest versus apathy. There it was, the diversity he was looking for. Feeling better now that he had even marginally differentiated himself from Gaara, Naruto rose to his feet and faced his tutor. The Chunin exams were over and the third Hokage was dead, but life would go on. Everything he needed to become the shinobi he wanted to be was still within his grasp: plants, senbon, jars, Zetsu, Ino, and now, Tenten. "Let's go," he told the plant man, "I've got things to do." With the threat Gaara had posed gone, it was time to catch up on his training. LLL. That will be all for this video. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and comment down below for more videos. Goodbye.